Hey guys, tonight we begin with Victorian widows poisoning themselves to death, not from grief, but from their mourning clothes. While you might imagine elegant black veils as romantic symbols of loss, the reality was arsenic, laced fabric slowly destroying skin, lungs, and sanity just to look appropriately sad. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself as a 28-year-old woman in London, 1862. Your husband died 3 days ago, and you are standing in a dressmaker's shop being fitted for mourning clothes that will define your entire existence for the next 2 years minimum. The seamstress is wrapping you in bolt after bolt of the deepest black fabric money can buy, and you have no idea that the beautiful rich black dye soaking into that cloth contains enough arsenic to kill you slowly over the months ahead. You are about to enter a world where grief isn't just an emotion, it is a performance, a social obligation, and quite literally, a deadly fashion statement. Let me show you exactly how deadly. According to research by Dr. Alison Matthews, David at Ryerson University, a single Victorian mourning dress could contain anywhere from 60 to 900 grains of arsenic trioxide, depending on how deep and rich the black needed to be. For context, just 4 to 5 grains of arsenic can kill an adult human if ingested. You are wearing the equivalent of 150 fatal doses wrapped around your body, pressed against your skin, releasing toxic dust with every movement. But here is what makes this truly horrifying. You know the fabric is toxic. Everyone knows. The newspapers are full of stories about women dying from their mourning clothes, about skin lesions and respiratory failure and mysterious illnesses that only affect widows. But you wear it anyway, because not wearing proper mourning attire is social suicide. In Victorian England, you'd rather risk actual death than face the scandal of inadequate grief display. The rules for Victorian mourning were insanely specific and absolutely rigid. You couldn't just throw on a black dress and call it a day. No, there was an entire taxonomy of grief, broken down by relationship, time period, and acceptable fabrics. And you had to follow every single rule perfectly, or you'd be branded as heartless, immoral, possibly a murderer who was glad her husband was dead. Let's walk through what you as a newly made widow are required to wear. For the first year and 1 day, yes, 1 day, because Victoria loved arbitrary precision, you are in what is called deep mourning, or first mourning. This means Parramatta, a heavy silk and wool blend that has been dyed the blackest black achievable with arsenical dyes. No shine, absolutely matte black, that seems to absorb light. Your dress must be completely plain, no ornamentation except jet beads, which we'll get to later because they're their own nightmare. You are also wearing a widow's cap and a crepe veil. The veil is crucial. It is made of crepe, a crimped fabric that is stiff, scratchy, and surprise, loaded with even more arsenic than the dress, because crepe requires multiple dye baths to achieve the right depth of black. The veil covers your face completely during the first months. You are literally veiled from the world, hidden, erased, transformed into a walking monument to death. The crepe feels like wearing sandpaper on your face. It is harsh, uncomfortable, deliberately so. According to fashion historian Dr. Lou Taylor from the University of Brighton, the discomfort was intentional. Mourning clothes were supposed to be a burden, a constant physical reminder of loss. You weren't meant to be comfortable. You were meant to suffer visibly, and you do suffer. Within weeks of wearing your mourning ensemble, you start to notice changes. Your skin where the fabric touches, your neck, your wrists, your waist becomes irritated. Little red patches appear. They itch constantly. You assume it is just the rough fabric, the stress of grief, the weight of loss. You have no idea that arsenic is leaching into your skin, accumulating in your body, starting the slow process of poisoning. Let me introduce you to someone who lived this nightmare. Her name was Isabella Banks, and she was a 31-year-old widow in Manchester, 1869. We know about Isabella because her physician, Dr. Thomas Orton, documented her case in the British Medical Journal. Isabella's husband died of typhoid, and she commissioned an elaborate mourning wardrobe. 3 changes of deep mourning dresses, multiple veils, black gloves, black parasol, black dyed undergarments. She was following the rules perfectly, demonstrating appropriate grief. 3 months into her mourning period, Isabella began experiencing severe headaches, nausea, and a persistent cough. Her skin developed lesions that wouldn't heal. Her hair started falling out. Dr. Orton initially diagnosed grief-induced hysteria, which was the default medical explanation for any woman's ailment. But when Isabella showed him the green discoloration on her undergarments, where they'd touched her skin, a telltale sign of arsenical dye transfer, he realized what was happening. The mourning clothes were killing her. Dr. Orton ordered Isabella to immediately cease wearing the arsenical dyed clothes and switch to naturally dyed alternatives. She refused. Not because she wanted to die, but because switching would signal to society that her grief wasn't genuine, that she was moving on too quickly, that she didn't truly love her husband. The social pressure was so intense that she chose slow poisoning over social censure. Isabella Banks died 7 months into her mourning period. The official cause of death was recorded as chronic arsenical poisoning from mourning attire, making her one of the few Victorian women whose death was officially attributed to fashion, rather than being dismissed as natural causes or female hysteria. But Isabella wasn't alone. The British Medical Journal between 1860 and 1895 published over 200 documented cases of arsenical poisoning from mourning clothes, and those were just the cases doctors recognised and reported. Dr. David estimates that thousands of Victorian women likely died from their mourning attire, their deaths attributed to grief, broken hearts, or the vague Victorian diagnosis of decline. Now let's talk about why the black dye was so toxic. Victorian society was obsessed with achieving the perfect black. Not just any black, a deep, rich, absolute black that showed the depth of your mourning. Natural black dyes existed, but they produced greyish, inconsistent colours that faded quickly. Enter arsenical dyes, particularly a compound called Paris green, which when combined with other chemicals could produce the most intense, light-absorbing black fabric ever created. The process of dyeing fabric with arsenical compounds was brutal. According to research by Dr. James Horton at the University of Washington, dye workers, mostly women and children, would stand for 12-hour shifts in vats of arsenical solution, stirring fabric with their bare hands. Their skin would turn grey-green. Their hair would fall out. Many went blind from the arsenic vapour. The average life expectancy of an arsenical dye worker was 32 years, but the demand for deep black mourning fabric was so high that factories couldn't stop production. Queen Victoria herself, after Prince Albert's death in 1861, wore nothing but black mourning clothes for the remaining 40 years of her life. She set the standard, and every woman in the British Empire was expected to follow. The Queen's grief became a national industry, and that industry literally ran on poison. You, as a Victorian widow, are part of this industry, whether you want to be or not. Every time you wear your mourning dress, every time the fabric shifts and releases a small cloud of arsenical dust, you are breathing in poison. Every time you touch your veil and then touch your face, you are transferring arsenic to your lips, your eyes, your mouth. If you are nursing a child while in mourning, and many women were, you are passing arsenic through your breast milk. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are insidious. They creep up slowly, mimicking other illnesses, often dismissed as emotional distress. You experience persistent nausea, which everyone assumes is grief. You develop a chronic cough attributed to the stress of loss. Your skin develops dark patches and lesions, explained away as the physical manifestation of a broken heart. Your hair thins and falls out, seen as another sign of grief's toll on your body. What is actually happening is that arsenic is accumulating in your tissues, particularly your skin, hair, and nails. It is interfering with cellular respiration, essentially suffocating your cells from the inside. It is causing peripheral neuropathy, which is why your hands and feet are constantly tingling and numb. It is damaging your kidneys and liver, though no Victorian doctor would think to check those organs in a grieving widow. Let's examine another victim, because individual stories make this horror real. Meet Charlotte Harrison, a 24-year-old widow in Edinburgh, 1875. Charlotte's husband died in a factory accident, leaving her with 2 young children and no income. She couldn't afford an elaborate mourning wardrobe, but social pressure demanded she dress appropriately. So she did what many poor widows did. She bought cheap, second-hand mourning clothes from a dealer in used garments. Second-hand mourning clothes were often even more dangerous than new ones. They'd been worn by previous widows, saturated with their sweat. The arsenical dyes partially degraded into even more toxic compounds. Charlotte's dress had probably been through 3 or 4 widows before her. According to an account in the Edinburgh Medical Journal, Charlotte developed severe arsenical poisoning within 6 weeks. Her children, who slept in the same bed with her, also showed signs of arsenic exposure. A local physician, Dr. Margaret Campbell, one of the few female doctors of the era, recognised the poisoning and publicly campaigned for Charlotte's case to be brought before the Edinburgh health authorities. Dr. Campbell argued that forcing poor widows into toxic mourning clothes was essentially class-based murder. Her campaign was largely ignored, but her documentation of Charlotte's case provides us with detailed insight into how arsenical mourning clothes affected the working poor. Charlotte survived barely, but was left with permanent nerve damage in her hands, making it impossible for her to do the fine needlework that had been her only source of income. She ended up in a workhouse, destitute, destroyed not by her husband's death, but by the social requirement to perform grief in poison-soaked fabric. Now, let's talk about the veils, because they deserve special attention. Victorian mourning veils were masterpieces of toxic fashion. They were made from crepe, which required a special manufacturing process involving heat, pressure, and multiple chemical treatments to create the characteristic crimped texture. The black dye used on crepe was even more concentrated than on regular fabric, because crepe's texture made it harder for dye to penetrate evenly. You are wearing a veil that covers your entire face and falls past your shoulders. It is so dense that you can barely see through it. The world becomes a dark blur, which is symbolically appropriate. You are supposed to be withdrawn from the world, but practically dangerous. Victorian newspapers regularly reported widows injured in street accidents because they literally couldn't see where they were going through their heavy crepe veils. But the physical obstruction is the least of the veil's problems. Every breath you take draws air through that arsenical crepe, pulling microscopic particles of arsenic directly into your lungs. You are essentially using your veil as a slow-release poison delivery system, inhaling toxins with every breath for hours every day. According to Dr. Alison Matthews, David's analysis of Victorian mourning veils in museum collections, the amount of arsenic in a standard widow's veil could exceed 800 grains. You are breathing through a filter made of concentrated poison. The damage to your respiratory system is cumulative and irreversible. Many Victorian widows developed chronic lung conditions that doctors attributed to the stress of grief, but were actually arsenical pneumonitis, inflammation of the lungs from chronic arsenic inhalation. The veil also created a microenvironment around your face where heat and moisture from your breath would concentrate, causing the arsenical dyes to break down and become even more volatile. You are creating your own personal poison chamber every time you wear your veil, and you wear it every day, all day, for months. Let me introduce you to another widow, because the more individual stories we examine, the more the full horror becomes clear. Her name was Amelia Westbrook, and she was a 35-year-old widow in London, 1881. Amelia was wealthy, which meant she could afford the finest mourning clothes, the blackest blacks, the most elaborate crepe, multiple changes of outfit to show the depth of her grief and the extent of her devotion. Amelia's case is documented in the private papers of her physician, Dr. Edmund Saunderson, which are now held at the Royal College of Physicians. Dr. Saunderson noted that Amelia began experiencing severe facial pain about 4 months into her mourning period. Her skin beneath the veil developed what he described as angry, weeping sores that would not heal. Her eyes became chronically inflamed and sensitive to light. She developed a persistent cough that produced dark, bloody sputum. Dr. Saunderson suspected arsenical poisoning and tested Amelia's veil using the Marsh test, a chemical analysis that could detect arsenic. The veil contained, in his words, an absolutely shocking quantity of arsenical compounds, sufficient to cause grave harm or death with prolonged exposure. He recommended she immediately cease wearing the veil. Amelia's response is telling. She wrote in her diary, which Dr. Saunderson quoted in his notes, "Dr. Saunderson means well, but he does not understand that to appear in public without proper mourning is to dishonour Edward's memory. Society would judge me harshly. Better to suffer in body than to suffer in reputation. I shall continue to wear the veil as long as propriety demands." Amelia Westbrook died 8 months into her mourning period. The cause of death was officially recorded as consumption, but Dr. Saunderson's private notes clearly state, "Death by arsenical poisoning from mourning attire." Despite repeated warnings, she chose social acceptance over survival, and Victorian society rewarded her choice by giving her a lavish funeral where everyone praised her devotion and the depth of her grief. No one mentioned that her devotion had literally killed her. Now let's discuss the other elements of Victorian mourning fashion, because the dress and veil weren't the only dangerous components. You are also wearing mourning jewellery, and in the Victorian era, the most appropriate mourning jewellery was made from the hair of the deceased. Yes, hair, human hair. Your dead husband's hair, woven into bracelets, brooches, rings, lockets, even elaborate wreaths. This wasn't considered morbid. It was seen as beautiful, intimate, a way to keep the deceased literally close to your body. There were professional hair artists who would take a lock of the deceased's hair and transform it into intricate jewellery pieces. The process of creating hair jewellery involved cleaning the hair with various chemical solutions, often including mercury compounds to kill any parasites or bacteria. The hair would then be woven, braided or shaped around wire forms. Sometimes it was mixed with adhesives containing lead. The finished piece would be set in a mounting, often jet or bog oak, which had their own issues we'll discuss shortly. You are wearing a bracelet made from your husband's hair on your left wrist, the wrist closest to your heart. It is a beautiful piece, intricately woven, enclosed in a glass-fronted locket surrounded by jet beads. Every time you look at it, you are supposed to feel connected to your lost love. What you don't know is that the mercury used to process the hair is slowly volatilizing from the warmth of your skin, releasing vapor that you are absorbing transdermally. You are being poisoned by your husband's hair. Mercury poisoning has different symptoms than arsenic poisoning, but they're equally devastating. You develop tremors in your hands. Your gums become inflamed and painful. You experience mood swings, irritability, depression, all of which are attributed to grief but are actually mercury affecting your nervous system. You have trouble concentrating, memory problems, insomnia. Victorian doctors called this widow's melancholy, never realizing it was actually heavy metal poisoning from mourning jewellery. Let me tell you about Martha Dennison, a 29-year-old widow in Bristol, 1867. Martha commissioned an elaborate hair jewellery set after her husband's death. A necklace, 2 bracelets, a brooch, and a ring, all made from his hair. She wore these pieces every day for 18 months. According to an account in the Bristol Medical Chirurgical Journal, Martha developed severe neurological symptoms, including tremors, difficulty walking, and what the physician described as a profound melancholic madness. Martha became convinced that her husband was speaking to her through the hair jewelry, giving her instructions from beyond the grave. She would hold long conversations with her bracelet, responding to voices only she could hear. Her family assumed she'd gone mad from grief and had her committed to a private asylum. The asylum physician, Dr. Robert Gardiner, was more observant than most. He noticed that Martha's symptoms worsened when she wore the hair jewelry and improved when it was removed. He tested the jewelry and found significant mercury contamination from the processing chemicals. Once the jewelry was permanently removed and Martha was treated with what passed for mercury poisoning remedies in 1867, her madness gradually resolved. Dr. Gardner published Martha's case as evidence that hair jewelry could cause poisoning, but his findings were largely dismissed. The Victorian public didn't want to believe that their cherished mourning traditions were dangerous. Hair jewellery continued to be made and worn for decades after Martha's case was published. But hair jewellery wasn't the only problematic mourning accessory. Let's talk about jet. Jet is a type of fossilised wood that can be polished to a deep, glossy black. It became the only acceptable embellishment for mourning clothes during the Victorian era. Jet beads, jet buttons, jet brooches, jet earrings. If your mourning outfit had any ornamentation at all, it had to be jet. Real jet came primarily from Whitby in northern England, and demand was so high that the jet industry couldn't keep up. So manufacturers created French jet, which wasn't jet at all but black glass. The glass was often coloured with, you guessed it, arsenic compounds to achieve the right shade of black. And because it was glass, it was sharp when it broke, which it did frequently because mourning jewellery was worn daily for years. You are wearing jet beads around your neck. Some are real Whitby jet, some are French jet. You can't really tell the difference. One of the French jet beads cracks from the warmth of your body and the pressure of the thread. A tiny shard of glass coated with arsenical dye embeds itself in your skin. You don't notice because it is so small, barely a pinprick, but that tiny shard is now slowly releasing arsenic directly into your bloodstream. You develop a small infection around the site, which festers and refuses to heal because arsenic interferes with wound healing. Eventually you'll have a permanent scar, a small dark mark on your neck, a physical brand of widowhood that will never fade. According to research by Dr. Helen Persson at the Victoria and Albert Museum, examination of Victorian mourning jewellery in museum collections shows that approximately 60% of jet pieces are actually French jet, and nearly all of those contain detectable levels of arsenic in the glass or in the adhesives used to construct them. Women were literally decorating themselves with poison and calling it beautiful. Now let's discuss the social pressure that made all of this not just acceptable but mandatory. Victorian mourning wasn't just about personal grief. It was a public performance subject to intense scrutiny and rigid rules. Society was watching you constantly, judging whether your mourning was deep enough, long enough, expensive enough. Your grief had to be visible, quantifiable, and above all, fashionable. The rules varied depending on your relationship to the deceased. As a widow, you had the longest and most stringent mourning requirements, 2.5 to 3 years total, 1 year of deep mourning in full black with crepe, 9 months of second mourning with slightly less crepe, 6 months of ordinary mourning in black silk, 6 months of half mourning where you could finally introduce grey, white and purple. But if you were mourning a parent, only 1 year total, a sibling, 6 months, a grandparent, 6 months, a child, and this is devastating, a child required the same mourning period as a grandparent, 6 months. Victorian society valued adult relationships over the parent-child bond. which tells you something dark about how they viewed childhood mortality. And these weren't suggestions. They were enforced by social ostracism. If you appeared in public in colours during your mourning period, people would literally turn their backs on you. You'd be cut from social events, dropped from invitation lists, whispered about as immoral or suspicious. Did she kill her husband if she is so eager to get out of mourning? Was their marriage unhappy? Is she indecent? The pressure fell especially hard on young widows because society suspected you might want to remarry, and remarriage required you to be out of mourning. So if you showed any signs of lightening your mourning early, you'd be accused of husband hunting, of being mercenary, of not truly loving your deceased spouse. You had to prove your devotion through suffering, and that suffering had to be visible. Let me tell you about Caroline Ashford, a 26-year-old widow in Manchester, 1871. Caroline's husband died, leaving her with 3 children under age 5 and no income. She desperately needed to remarry for financial survival, but social custom required her to wait until she completed at least 2 years of mourning. 2 years with young children, and no money was impossible. Caroline made the choice to shorten her mourning period to 1 year, appearing in half-mourning colours after just 12 months. According to accounts in the Manchester Guardian, she was socially destroyed. Her neighbours stopped speaking to her. Shopkeepers refused to serve her. The church congregation literally turned their backs when she entered. She was branded as indecent, possibly a murderess, certainly immoral. Caroline couldn't take the social pressure. She retreated back into full mourning, including the arsenical dyed dress and veil she'd briefly escaped. According to parish records, she died 6 months later of respiratory failure, though given the timeline and her sudden return to toxic mourning clothes, arsenical poisoning is far more likely. She was 27 years old. Her children ended up in an orphanage. Society killed Caroline Ashford as surely as if they'd administered the arsenic directly. The rules, the judgment, the ostracism, it all forced her back into poisonous clothes that destroyed her. And no one was held accountable because she died in the socially approved manner, grieving appropriately in proper mourning attire. The fashion industry, of course, profited enormously from all of this. Mourning warehouses were huge businesses in Victorian cities. The most famous was Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse, which occupied an entire city block and employed over 200 people. You could walk in as a new widow and walk out completely outfitted in mourning attire, from your arsenical dyed dress to your mercury, processed hair jewellery, to your potentially toxic jet beads. Jay's and similar establishments had an entire department dedicated to sudden mourning for families who needed to dress quickly after an unexpected death. They kept hundreds of ready-made mourning outfits in standard sizes, all dyed the deepest black with arsenical compounds, because that is what customers demanded. Speed and convenience trumped safety every time. The marketing for these establishments is darkly fascinating. Advertisements in Victorian newspapers emphasised the richness and depth of their blacks, the quality of their crepe, the appropriateness and fashionability of their designs. They never mentioned that their products were toxic. They sold grief as a commodity, and they made fortunes from it. According to economic historian Dr. Peter N. Stearns at George Mason University, the Victorian mourning industry at its peak in the 1880s generated approximately £2 million, annually equivalent to roughly £230 million, or $285 million in today's money. That is a $250 million industry built on selling poison to grieving women and telling them it was their social duty to wear it. Now let's talk about the voices of resistance, because there were people who recognised how insane and dangerous this system was. The problem was that those voices were mostly women, and Victorian society wasn't particularly interested in listening to women's concerns about women's fashion, even when those concerns were literally life and death. The Ladies' Sanitary Association, founded in 1857, began campaigning against arsenical dyes in the 1860s. They published pamphlets with titles like Death in the Dye Pot and The Arsenic Waltz, warning women about the dangers of fashionable fabrics. They provided lists of dye houses that used non-arsenical alternatives. They lobbied Parliament for regulation of the dye industry. Their efforts were largely unsuccessful. The dye industry was too profitable, too politically connected, too essential to British manufacturing. Parliament held hearings on arsenical dyes in 1862 and concluded that while there might be some danger, it was greatly exaggerated, and besides, women should be responsible for their own fashion choices. The victim blaming was blatant. If women chose to wear dangerous clothes, that was their own fault. The medical community was split. Some physicians, like Dr. Orton, who treated Isabella Banks, recognized arsenical poisoning from clothing and spoke out against it. Others dismissed the concerns as feminine hysteria, arguing that any illness in grieving widows was obviously caused by grief, not by fabric. The idea that fashion could kill was too radical, too threatening to economic interests, too inconvenient to accept. But women kept dying. The British Medical Journal articles kept piling up. The case studies kept multiplying, and slowly, very slowly, the message started to get through. By the 1890s, some fashion-forward women began refusing to wear arsenical-dyed mourning clothes, opting instead for naturally dyed alternatives, even if they weren't quite as intensely black. This was an act of remarkable courage. Choosing natural dyes meant your mourning looked less deep, less fashionable, potentially less sincere. You were opening yourself up to social judgment and criticism, but you were also choosing not to poison yourself, which seems like an obvious choice, but wasn't treated as one by Victorian society. Let me introduce you to Lady Florence Dixie, a Scottish aristocrat who became one of the most vocal opponents of toxic mourning fashion. After her brother died in 1882, Lady Florence publicly refused to wear arsenical mourning clothes, instead commissioning garments dyed with natural indigo and logwood. She wrote articles for the Morning Post, condemning the mourning industry as a commercial conspiracy to poison grieving women for profit. Lady Florence was viciously attacked in the press and in society. She was called unladylike, unnatural, insufficiently grieving. Critics claimed she didn't truly love her brother if she couldn't be bothered to wear proper mourning. But Lady Florence had the privilege of title and wealth that protected her from the worst of the social consequences. She could afford to be radical. Most women couldn't. What is fascinating is that Lady Florence's protest eventually helped shift public opinion, but it took decades. She began her campaign in 1882. Arsenical dyes weren't effectively banned in Britain until the 1903 Factory and Workshop Act, which finally regulated the use of arsenic in textile manufacturing. That is 21 years of continued poisoning after a prominent aristocrat tried to raise the alarm. How many women died in those 21 years? We'll never know exactly, but Dr. David estimates conservatively that thousands of British women suffered significant health consequences from arsenical mourning clothes between 1882 and 1903, and hundreds likely died. The delay in regulation killed people, and the delay was caused by economic interests, social conservatism, and the devaluation of women's health concerns. Now let's examine what happens to you physically as you progress through the mourning period, because the timeline of arsenic poisoning maps eerily onto the timeline of Victorian mourning. The first few months in deep mourning, when you are wearing the most heavily dyed fabrics and the thickest crepe veils, coincide with the onset of chronic arsenic exposure symptoms. You are 3 months into mourning. You've been wearing your arsenical dress and veil every day, all day. Your skin where the fabric touches is now covered in what Victorian doctors called mourning rash, red, inflamed, sometimes blistering lesions that itch intensely. You've been told this is normal, that grief manifests physically, that it is your body expressing what your mind cannot. You have no idea it is actually contact dermatitis from arsenic. You are experiencing persistent nausea and have lost weight, which everyone attributes to grief suppressing your appetite. Actually, arsenic is damaging your gastrointestinal tract, causing chronic inflammation and interfering with nutrient absorption. You are literally wasting away. And it is not from sadness. Your hair is falling out in disturbing quantities. Every time you brush it, the brush is full of hair. Your scalp is visible through what used to be thick locks. Again, this is attributed to grief, to the stress of loss, to the physical manifestation of a broken heart. But it is arsenic accumulating in your hair follicles, disrupting the growth cycle, causing hair to become brittle and fall out. You are 6 months into mourning. You've moved from deep mourning to second mourning, which means slightly less crepe but still full black. By now, the arsenic has accumulated in your body to dangerous levels. You are experiencing neurological symptoms, tingling in your hands and feet, difficulty with coordination, occasional tremors. Your vision is becoming blurry, and you are sensitive to light. These symptoms terrify you because you don't understand them. You consult a doctor who examines you and concludes that you are suffering from grief-induced neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis that basically means your female nervous system is too delicate to handle strong emotions. He prescribes rest, fresh air, and possibly a nerve tonic that contains. And I am not making this up, small amounts of arsenic, because arsenic was considered a medical treatment for various nervous conditions. You are being prescribed the very poison that is killing you as a treatment for the symptoms of that poisoning. The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. You are 1 year into mourning. You are in ordinary mourning now. Black silk instead of crepe, which means less arsenic exposure, but you've already accumulated enough in your tissues to cause lasting damage. You are chronically fatigued, constantly sick with various infections because arsenic has compromised your immune system. Your skin has developed dark patches of hyperpigmentation, especially on your hands and feet, a classic sign of chronic arsenic exposure that Victorian doctors didn't recognize. You look in the mirror and barely recognize yourself. You are pale, thin, your hair sparse, your skin marked and scarred. You look like grief personified, which is exactly what Victorian society wants. Your physical deterioration is read as evidence of the depth of your love, the sincerity of your mourning. You are dying, and everyone is praising you for it. Let me tell you about one more widow, because her story encapsulates everything we've discussed. Her name was Eleanor Hartley, and she was a 33-year-old widow in Birmingham, 1878. Eleanor was well-educated, relatively wealthy, and kept a detailed diary throughout her mourning period. Her diary was preserved by her descendants and eventually donated to the Birmingham archives, where historian Dr. Ruth Richardson analysed it as part of her research on Victorian mourning culture. Eleanor's diary is a day-by-day account of physical deterioration intertwined with grief. In the first entry after her husband's death, she writes, "I have ordered the mourning clothes from Jay's. The seamstress assures me they are the finest black available. I shall wear them as a testament to Charles's worth." She sounds almost eager, viewing the mourning clothes as an opportunity to demonstrate love. 3 months later, the dress causes the most peculiar rash. My skin burns and itches where the fabric touches. I mentioned this to Dr. Pemberton, who said it is the physical manifestation of my broken heart. How strange that grief should express itself in such a corporeal manner. 6 months later, I am unwell more often than not, nauseous, weak, prone to fevers. My hair comes out in handfuls when I brush it. Mother says I am wasting away from grief, that I loved Charles too deeply, that some hearts cannot survive such loss. I fear she may be right. I do not feel I shall survive this. 9 months later, the headaches are constant now. My hands shake so that I can barely write. Dr. Pemberton has prescribed arsenic tonic for my nerves, which seems to help slightly, though I wonder if it might be making the skin troubles worse. The final entry, written by someone else, Likely Eleanor's sister, Eleanor passed this morning. She has finally joined Charles in eternal rest. Her suffering was profound, her grief unmatched. She was the model of a devoted wife, mourning unto death. Eleanor Hartley died from arsenical poisoning from her mourning clothes and the arsenic tonic prescribed to treat symptoms of that poisoning. Her diary documents her own murder by social custom and medical incompetence, and she was praised for it, held up as an example of proper feminine devotion. Dr. Richardson's analysis of Eleanor's diary alongside the medical records Dr. Pemberton kept also archived makes it clear that Eleanor was describing classic arsenic poisoning symptoms, but neither she nor her doctor recognized them as such. The poisoning was hiding in plain sight, disguised as appropriate grief. Now, let's talk about what happened to widows who survived the mourning period, because surviving didn't mean escaping unscathed. The damage from chronic arsenic exposure is often permanent. You emerge from your 2.5 years of mourning finally allowed to wear colours again, freed from the crape and the veil and the arsenical fabric, but your body will never fully recover. Arsenic accumulates in keratinous tissues, hair, nails, skin. It stays there for years, continuing to cause problems long after exposure ends. You'll have chronic skin issues for the rest of your life, mysterious rashes and lesions that come and go. Your nails will develop mesalines, horizontal white bands that are a hallmark of arsenic exposure. Your hair will never be as thick as it once was. The neurological damage is often permanent too. That peripheral neuropathy, the tingling and numbness in your hands and feet, may never fully resolve. You might have chronic pain, coordination problems, tremors. These symptoms will interfere with daily life, make it harder to do fine work with your hands, affect your ability to walk distances, and the psychological impact is profound. You've spent over 2 years in a state of enforced grief, performing sorrow for society's benefit, poisoning yourself to prove your devotion. Even after the mourning period ends, that experience has changed you fundamentally. Many Victorian widows struggled to re-enter normal life after such an extended period of isolation and suffering. Some widows chose never to leave mourning. Queen Victoria famously wore mourning for Prince Albert for 40 years until her own death. She was praised for this, held up as the ultimate example of devoted widowhood. But think about what that means. 40 years in black, 40 years of chronic arsenic exposure from her clothing, 40 years of her health being slowly undermined by fabric dye. Queen Victoria in her later years suffered from numerous health problems, chronic fatigue, skin conditions, neurological issues including tremors and poor coordination. Her physicians attributed these to age and the strain of ruling an empire. No one suggested that 4 decades of arsenical mourning clothes might be a contributing factor. But given what we know now about the toxicity of Victorian mourning attire, it is very possible that the Queen's devotion to mourning literally poisoned her for half her life. And because the Queen wore mourning for 40 years, thousands of other women felt pressured to extend their own mourning periods, to show similar devotion, to prove they were as loving as their monarch. Victoria's grief became a template that killed women across the British Empire. Let's examine the class dimensions of this poisoning, because toxic mourning clothes affected different social classes in different ways. If you were wealthy, you could afford multiple changes of mourning clothes, which meant any individual dress was worn less frequently, slightly reducing your exposure. You could afford better quality fabrics that might be more evenly dyed and therefore slightly less likely to shed arsenic dust. You could afford to see doctors more regularly, though those doctors usually didn't help. If you were working class or poor, you were far more vulnerable. You might have only one mourning dress that you wore constantly for the entire mourning period. That dress was probably second-hand, which meant it had already been saturated with someone else's sweat. The arsenic partially broken down into even more toxic forms. You couldn't afford to see doctors. so your symptoms would go untreated and unrecognized. And if you were working class, you didn't have the luxury of staying home during your mourning period. You had to work, so you wore your arsenical mourning dress to the factory, the shop, the laundry, wherever you laboured. You sweated in it during long shifts, which increased the arsenic absorption through your skin. You breathed harder from physical labour, which meant you inhaled more arsenical dust from your veil and clothing. Your poison exposure was intensified by the necessity of working while grieving. According to research by Dr. Emma Griffin at the University of East Anglia, working-class Victorian women had shorter life expectancies than their wealthier counterparts. And while many factors contributed to this, toxic clothing was likely a significant but overlooked element. Working women wore cheap dyed fabrics constantly, not just mourning clothes, but everyday work clothes dyed with similar arsenical compounds, and the cumulative exposure over a lifetime was devastating. There is also a gendered dimension that is important to examine. Men had mourning requirements too, but they were far less stringent and far less toxic. A widower was expected to wear a black suit and a black armband for 6 months to a year. The black dye in men's suits was usually less intense than in women's mourning dresses because men's fashion didn't demand the same absolute, light-absorbing black. Men didn't wear veils, didn't wear elaborate crepe, didn't cover themselves head to toe in arsenical fabric. This meant that men's arsenic exposure from mourning clothes was significantly lower than women's, and men's mourning periods were shorter, ending after a year at most, while women mourned for 2.5 years or more. Men could remarry as soon as their mourning ended with no social stigma. Women who remarried too quickly, anything less than 2 years, were condemned as indecent. The entire system was designed to control women's bodies, women's sexuality, women's social mobility. Mourning clothes kept you covered, hidden, removed from public life. Mourning periods kept you off the marriage market, prevented you from forming new attachments, and the toxicity of the clothes literally damaged your body, making you sick, making you dependent, making you vulnerable. It is hard not to see this as a form of social control disguised as fashion. The patriarchal Victorian society found a way to regulate widows, women who had briefly enjoyed the relative freedom of being married, and then were suddenly independent, by trapping them in a system of performative grief that was literally poisonous. Now let's talk about the children who grew up surrounded by this toxicity. If you are a widow with children, your mourning clothes don't just affect you. Your children are exposed too. When you hold them, they're pressed against arsenical fabric. When you nurse infants, they're breathing arsenic dust from your bodice. When toddlers play around your skirts, they're inhaling toxins from your dress. Victorian medical literature contains multiple references to children developing arsenical poisoning symptoms that physicians couldn't explain until they realized the children's mothers were in mourning. The children weren't directly exposed to arsenical fabrics, but the constant proximity to their poisoned mothers was enough to make them sick. There is a particularly heartbreaking case documented in The Lancet in 1873. A widow named Sarah Mitchell was in deep mourning for her husband. Her infant daughter, just 8 months old, developed severe respiratory distress and skin lesions. The physician treating the child, Dr. William Broadbent, couldn't determine the cause until he thought to test Sarah's mourning dress. The dress was so heavily laden with arsenic that simply holding the child against it during nursing and daily care had poisoned her. Dr. Broadbent ordered Sarah to immediately stop wearing the mourning dress and switch to undyed natural fabrics. Sarah was horrified. Abandoning mourning clothes felt like abandoning her husband's memory and inviting social condemnation. But her daughter was dying. She made the agonizing choice to put away the mourning dress. Her neighbours interpreted this as evidence that Sarah hadn't truly loved her husband, that she was indecent, that she was probably eager to remarry. Sarah was ostracised by her community, but her daughter recovered. Sarah chose her child's life over social acceptance, and she paid a heavy price in isolation and judgment. That she had to make this choice at all shows how deeply broken the system was. Now let's examine the specific chemistry of why arsenical dyes were so toxic and why they were so popular despite the danger. Arsenic is a metalloid element that can exist in several different chemical forms. The arsenic compounds used in Victorian dyes were primarily arsenic trioxide, ASIO, and various arsenite and arsenate salts. These compounds worked as dyes or dye mordants, substances that help dyes bind to fabric, because arsenic has a chemical affinity for proteins, which are abundant in natural fibres like silk and wool. The arsenic would bond tightly to the fabric, creating intense, stable colours that didn't fade easily. This was a huge selling point in an era before modern synthetic dyes. A dress dyed with arsenical compounds would stay richly black for years, while naturally dyed fabrics would fade to grey relatively quickly. But that same chemical property that made arsenic bond tightly to fabric, its affinity for proteins, is exactly what makes it so toxic to humans. Your body is made of proteins. When arsenic comes in contact with your skin, it binds to proteins in your cells, disrupting their function. When you inhale arsenic dust, it binds to proteins in your lungs, causing inflammation and damage. When arsenic gets into your bloodstream, it interferes with cellular respiration by binding to enzymes, essentially suffocating your cells. According to toxicologist Dr. Michael Moore at the University of Queensland, arsenic is particularly insidious because it mimics phosphate, a crucial element in many biological processes. Your cells literally mistake arsenic for a nutrient and bring it inside, where it then disrupts normal function. This is why arsenic poisoning affects so many different body systems. It is interfering with fundamental cellular processes everywhere. The arsenical compounds in Victorian mourning clothes could enter your body through 3 routes: dermal absorption through skin contact, inhalation of arsenic-laden dust, and ingestion when you touched contaminated fabric and then touched your mouth or food. You were being poisoned from multiple directions simultaneously, and the cumulative exposure was devastating. What makes this even worse is that arsenic is a cumulative poison. Unlike some toxins that your body can process and eliminate relatively quickly, arsenic accumulates in your tissues over time. Each day you wear your arsenical mourning clothes, you are adding to your body's arsenic burden. The damage builds slowly, insidiously, until suddenly you are very sick and no one knows why. The lethal dose of arsenic varies depending on the form and route of exposure, but for arsenic trioxide, the most common form in Victorian dyes, the acute lethal dose is about 100 to 300 milligrams for an adult. You are not getting acute lethal doses from your mourning clothes, but you are getting chronic low-level exposure that adds up over months and years. Research by Dr. Andrew Meharg at Queen's University Belfast has analysed arsenic content in Victorian fabrics from museum collections. He found that some samples contained up to 20% arsenic by weight. That means a dress weighing, say, 2 kilograms, could contain 400 grams of arsenic compounds. Even if only a tiny fraction of that enters your body over months of wearing, it is more than enough to cause serious toxicity. Now let's talk about the parallels to modern fashion and how the Victorian poisoning protocol still echoes in contemporary culture. We like to think we've moved past the Victorian era's deadly fashion, but have we really? Modern fast fashion uses dyes and chemicals that workers in developing countries are exposed to daily, often with minimal safety protections. The workers who make your clothes are being poisoned so you can have cheap, fashionable garments, just like Victorian dye workers were poisoned so grieving widows could have deep black mourning clothes. According to research by the Clean Clothes Campaign, textile workers in Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, and other manufacturing hubs are regularly exposed to toxic dyes, solvents, and finishing chemicals. These workers develop skin conditions, respiratory problems, neurological issues, and cancers at rates far higher than the general population. The chemicals are different from Victorian arsenical dyes. Modern dyes use compounds like azo-dyes, formaldehyde resins, heavy metals like chromium, and lead, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. Fashion demands toxicity, and workers pay the price with their bodies. And just like Victorian society didn't want to acknowledge that mourning clothes were killing widows, modern consumers don't want to acknowledge that fast fashion is killing garment workers. It is inconvenient. It is uncomfortable. It requires changing behavior. Easier to assume the problem is exaggerated, or that someone else will fix it. There is also a parallel in how fashion still polices women's bodies and women's emotions. We don't force widows into ascenical mourning clothes anymore, but we still have rigid social expectations about how women should present grief, how they should dress to signal life events, how they should perform emotions through appearance. The mechanisms are different, but the underlying control is similar. Think about the social pressure women face to look a certain way after childbirth, to bounce back to pre-pregnancy bodies. Think about the judgment women face for their clothing choices in professional settings, the careful navigation of looking professional but not too masculine, attractive but not too sexual. Think about the cosmetics industry and the social pressure to wear makeup, to perform a certain kind of femininity, even though many cosmetics contain potentially harmful chemicals. According to the Environmental Working Group's analysis of cosmetic ingredients, the average woman uses 12 personal care products daily, containing 168 different chemicals, many of which are untested for long-term safety. Some modern cosmetics contain heavy metals, parabens, phthalates, synthetic fragrances, compounds that can act as endocrine disruptors, allergens, or potential carcinogens. You are not being poisoned with arsenic, but you might be exposing yourself to other toxins for the sake of meeting beauty standards. The Victorian widow had no choice but to wear poisonous mourning clothes or face social destruction. Modern women technically have choices, but those choices are constrained by social pressures, economic realities, and beauty standards that are just as rigid and just as harmful in their own ways. Let me be clear, I am not saying modern makeup is equivalent to Victorian arsenical mourning clothes. The toxicity levels are very different, and modern regulations do provide some consumer protection, but the underlying dynamic woman being encouraged or pressured to use potentially harmful products to meet social expectations about appearance has not disappeared. It has evolved, become more subtle, but it is still there. Now let's talk about how Victorian mourning culture eventually changed and what finally ended the era of poisonous grief. The shift happened gradually over several decades, driven by a combination of factors: medical evidence of harm, women's resistance, changing social attitudes, and eventually regulatory intervention. The medical evidence accumulated slowly through the late 1800s. More physicians recognized arsenical poisoning from clothing and began publishing case studies. The British medical journal, The Lancet, and other medical publications ran articles warning about toxic dyes. By the 1890s, the medical consensus was clear: arsenical dyes in clothing were dangerous and should be avoided. But medical consensus alone wasn't enough to change fashion. Women like Lady Florence Dixie provided high-profile examples of resistance, showing that it was possible to mourn without poison. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, campaigned for healthier clothing choices, including the elimination of toxic dyes. Their slogan was health, comfort, and beauty. All three were seen as radical demands for women's fashion. Social attitudes slowly shifted too. The late Victorian and Edwardian eras saw questioning of many rigid Victorian customs. Mourning periods gradually shortened. The rules became less stringent. Full mourning with heavy crepe fell out of fashion, replaced by simpler black clothes that didn't require as much arsenical dye. Queen Victoria's death in 1901 marked a symbolic end to the era of extreme mourning culture. Her son, Edward VII, deliberately chose a less somber court style, encouraging fashion that was elegant rather than grief-stricken. The long Victorian morning was finally over, and British society began to lighten up, literally and figuratively. Regulatory change came with the 1903 Factory and Workshop Act, which regulated the use of arsenic in various industries, including textile manufacturing. The Act didn't completely ban arsenical dyes, but it required manufacturers to minimize arsenic content and implement safety measures for workers. This made arsenical dyes more expensive and less convenient, which led manufacturers to develop alternative dyes. By 1910, arsenical dyes had largely disappeared from British mourning clothes. The deep blacks were now achieved with synthetic dyes like aniline black, which had its own problems, but wasn't as immediately toxic as arsenic. The era of poisonous mourning was ending, not because society suddenly decided to value women's health, but because alternatives became available and regulation made toxic dyes less profitable. But the damage was done. Decades of women had been poisoned by mourning clothes. Thousands had died or been permanently harmed. Children had been orphaned. Families destroyed. Lives cut short, all in service of social customs that prized appearance over well-being, conformity over survival. The Victorian poisoning protocol left scars on individuals and on society. Those scars are still visible if you know where to look. In museum collections where Victorian mourning clothes are carefully stored with warnings about arsenic contamination. In medical histories that document the prevalence of mysterious illnesses in 19th century women that were probably arsenic poisoning. In family trees where multiple women in mourning died young of natural causes that look suspiciously like poisoning when examined with modern knowledge. Let's end by examining what individual widows might want us to know if they could speak across the centuries. What would Isabella Banks, who chose social acceptance over survival, want to tell modern women? What lessons would Eleanor Hartley, who documented her own poisoning in her diary, want us to learn? What wisdom would Charlotte Harrison, destroyed by poverty and poisoned by second-hand clothes, want to share? They might tell us that social pressure can kill, that conformity has a price, sometimes the ultimate price, that systems that control women's bodies and police women's choices are always dangerous, even when they're wrapped in pretty language about propriety and devotion and love. They might warn us that profit motives will always prioritize money over safety unless forced to do otherwise, that industries will sell poison if there is a market for it, that we can't trust corporations to regulate themselves or to prioritize consumer health over corporate profit. They might emphasize that medical knowledge matters, that we should listen to scientific evidence, even when it contradicts social custom or commercial interests. That the Victorian doctors who recognized arsenical poisoning and spoke out were heroes, and the ones who dismissed women's symptoms as hysteria were complicit in murder. They might tell us to question beauty standards and fashion demands that require suffering, to ask what we're actually wearing and what it is doing to our bodies, to resist social pressures that value appearance over health, conformity over well-being. Most fundamentally, they might ask us to remember them, not as statistics or historical curiosities, but as real women who loved and grieved and were killed by a system that valued their performance of sorrow more than their lives. They wore poison because their society demanded it, and they died because that same society refused to acknowledge the harm it was causing. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the Victorian widow standing in front of her mirror, wrapped in arsenical black, veiled in toxic creep, decorated with poisonous beads. She is looking at her reflection and seeing a ghost, not her dead husband's ghost, but her own future ghost, because the clothes she is wearing are killing her, and she knows it, but can't stop, because the alternative is social death. Think about the choice she is making every day to prioritize society's approval over her own survival. Think about how that choice isn't freely made, but is coerced by a system of judgment and ostracism so powerful that death seems preferable to defying it. And then think about the choices you make about your own body, your own appearance, your own conformity to social standards. What are you wearing that might be harming you? What social pressures are you bowing to? What price are you paying for acceptance? The Victorian widow's story is extreme, but the underlying dynamics, social control, gendered expectations, the pressure to perform femininity even at personal cost, haven't disappeared. They've just changed form. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through Victorian mourning culture and the deadly fashion of grief. Thank you for bearing witness to the women who died in poisonous black, whose suffering was praised as devotion, whose deaths were celebrated as romantic tragedy. By understanding their stories, we honour their memory, and we equip ourselves to recognise when fashion, tradition, or social pressure demands too high a price. Now let's dive deeper into the specific medical mechanisms of how arsenical mourning clothes killed you, because understanding the science makes the horror more concrete. When you wear an arsenical-dyed dress, you are exposing yourself to arsenic through 3 primary routes: dermal absorption, inhalation, and inadvertent ingestion. Each route has its own timeline and its own set of devastating effects. Dermal absorption happens wherever the fabric touches your skin. Arsenic compounds can penetrate intact skin, especially when that skin is warm and sweaty, which yours constantly is under layers of heavy Victorian mourning clothes. According to research by Dr. David Bellinger at Harvard Medical School, transdermal arsenic absorption can be significant with prolonged skin contact, which is exactly what you are experiencing when you wear the same arsenical dress for 12 to 16 hours daily. The arsenic penetrates your epidermis and enters your bloodstream. From there, it is distributed throughout your body, but it has particular affinity for keratinous tissues. Your hair follicles accumulate arsenic, which is why your hair becomes brittle and falls out. Your nails develop mise lines, those horizontal white bands that are a hallmark of arsenic exposure. Your skin itself becomes a reservoir of arsenic, which explains the chronic lesions and hyperpigmentation that Victorian doctors attributed to grief. Inhalation is even more dangerous. Every time your dress rustles, every time you adjust your veil, you are releasing a small cloud of arsenical dust into the air you are breathing. This dust contains both larger particles that settle in your upper respiratory tract and microscopic particles that make it deep into your lungs. According to pulmonary toxicologist Dr. Brooke Mossman at the University of Vermont, chronic inhalation of arsenical dust causes inflammation of the bronchial passages, scarring of lung tissue, and eventually what we'd now recognize as chemical pneumonitis. You develop a chronic cough that produces dark sputum. Your breathing becomes labored, especially when you exert yourself. You are constantly short of breath, which limits your physical activity, which makes you weaker, which makes everything harder. Victorian doctors call this widow's decline and assume it is emotional. It is not. It is your lungs being slowly destroyed by poison dust. Inadvertent ingestion happens when you touch your dress or veil and then touch your mouth, eat food, smoke a cigarette, if you are of that class that smokes. Tiny amounts of arsenic transfer from fabric to fingers to mouth. It seems like it would be negligible, but it adds up over months. And if you are a woman who licks your fingers to turn pages while reading, or who bites your nails when anxious, or who unconsciously touches your face throughout the day, you are ingesting more arsenic than you realize. Once ingested, arsenic is absorbed through your gastrointestinal tract and processed by your liver and kidneys. These organs take the brunt of the damage. Your liver tries to metabolize the arsenic, converting it to slightly less toxic forms and preparing it for excretion, but chronic exposure overwhelms your liver's capacity. You develop what we'd now call hepatotoxicity, liver inflammation and damage that manifests as jaundice, fatigue, abdominal pain. Your kidneys try to filter arsenic from your blood and excrete it in urine, but chronic exposure damages the delicate filtering structures. You develop proteinuria, protein in your urine, though Victorian medicine wouldn't routinely test for this. Your kidney function declines gradually, causing fluid retention, fatigue, and eventually kidney failure. Let me introduce you to another widow whose medical case was particularly well documented. Her name was Georgina Weldon, and she was a 37-year-old widow in London, 1883. Georgina was unusual because she was educated, outspoken, and kept meticulous records of her own symptoms during her mourning period. She essentially documented her own poisoning in real time, creating a medical diary that Dr. L. Forbes Winslow, her physician, later analysed and published. Georgina's diary begins 3 days after her husband's death. Have ordered mourning clothes from Peter Robinson's. The expense is considerable, but necessary. Society demands I demonstrate proper grief. She sounds resigned, dutiful. 2 weeks later, the new mourning clothes arrived. The black is very deep and rich, exactly as it should be. The veil is heavy but appropriate. I shall wear them tomorrow to the funeral. 1 month later, have developed a persistent rash on my neck and wrists where the mourning dress touches. Dr. Winslow says it is nerves, prescribes laudanum. The rash itches terribly. 2 months later, the rash has spread to my torso. My hair comes out in alarming quantities when brushed. Feel constantly nauseous. Cannot eat without feeling ill. Dr. Winslow insists it is grief affecting my appetite. 4 months later, can barely sleep for the coughing. Produce dark sputum that frightens me. My hands tremble constantly. Dr. Winslow has tested my urine and found something he calls albuminuria, protein where there should be none. He says my kidneys are affected but cannot explain why. 6 months later, Dr. Winslow finally tested my mourning dress for arsenic content. The amount is, in his words, criminally excessive. He has ordered me to cease wearing it immediately and has reported the manufacturer to authorities. But the damage is done. My kidneys are failing, my lungs are scarred. I am dying from grief performance. Georgina Weldon's final diary entry, written 8 months into mourning. I understand now that I am dying not from losing Thomas, but from wearing black for him. The irony is bitter. The dress meant to honour his memory is sending me to join him. If anyone reads this, know that I fought. I tried to survive. But society demanded I dress my grief in poison, and poison does not negotiate. Georgina died 2 weeks after that final entry. Dr. Winslow performed an autopsy with her family's permission and found massive arsenic accumulation in her liver, kidneys and bones. He published her case, including extensive excerpts from her diary, in The Lancet in 1884. The article was titled "Death by Mourning, a Case of Arsenical Poisoning from Funeral Attire." It caused a brief scandal but little practical change. Georgina's case is particularly valuable to historians because her meticulous documentation provides a timeline of arsenic poisoning symptoms matched with specific exposure events. Her diary entries correlate with what modern toxicology knows about chronic arsenic exposure, validating that Victorian widows' decline was often actual poisoning. Now, let's examine the international dimensions of this poisoning, because toxic mourning fashion wasn't limited to Britain. Wherever Victorian fashion spread, and Victorian Britain's cultural influence spread nearly everywhere, arsenical mourning clothes followed. In the United States, Victorian mourning customs were adopted enthusiastically, especially in the Northeast and among the upper classes. American women following European fashion trends demanded the same deep blacks, the same heavy crepes, the same elaborate mourning jewellery. American textile mills responded by producing arsenical-dyed mourning fabrics domestically, often with even less regulation than British mills. According to research by Dr. Sarah Gordon at the University of Pennsylvania, American mourning warehouses in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia sold arsenical mourning clothes throughout the 1860s to 1890s. The most famous was Lord & Taylor's mourning department, which advertised the deepest, most fashionable blacks available without mentioning that the dyes contained arsenic. American women dyed from their mourning clothes just like British women did, but American medical journals were slower to recognize and document the poisoning. The American Medical Association's journal didn't publish its first case study of mourning clothes poisoning until 1887, decades after British journals had been documenting similar cases. Part of the delay was cultural. American physicians, predominantly male, were even more likely than their British counterparts to attribute women's symptoms to hysteria, emotional weakness, or the inherent fragility of the female constitution. The idea that fashion could kill seemed too radical, too threatening to social order. In France, mourning customs were different but equally rigid. French widows wore black for shorter periods than British widows, typically 1 year instead of 2.5. But the blacks had to be even deeper and more absolute. French fashion set European standards, and French blacks were legendary for their intensity. That intensity came from arsenical dyes, often in concentrations that made British arsenical fabrics look pale by comparison. According to research by Dr. Valerie Steele at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, analysis of French mourning clothes from the 1870s to 1880s shows arsenic concentrations up to 25% higher than comparable British garments. French textile manufacturers were particularly aggressive in their use of arsenical compounds, viewing them as essential to maintaining France's reputation for superior fashion. French medical journals documented cases of le deuil toxique, toxic mourning, but these cases were often attributed to poor quality fabrics worn by working-class women, rather than recognizing that all arsenical mourning clothes were dangerous regardless of quality. In Germany and Austria, mourning customs combined British style length with French style intensity, creating particularly dangerous conditions for widows. German widows were expected to wear deep black for extended periods, and German textile mills produced some of the most heavily arsenical fabrics in Europe. German medical journals published numerous cases of Trauer, Vergiftung, mourning poisoning, but regulatory responses were slow. The German case of Wilhelmine Schrader is particularly well documented. Wilhelmine was a 29-year-old widow in Berlin, 1878. She came from a prosperous merchant family and could afford the finest mourning clothes, which she ordered from a fashionable Berlin dressmaker. The dressmaker used imported French fabric, arsenical dyed to the deepest possible black. Wilhelmine developed severe arsenical poisoning within 4 months. Her symptoms were so acute that her physician Dr. Rudolf Virchow, one of the founders of modern pathology, suspected poisoning immediately. Dr. Virchow tested Wilhelmine's mourning clothes and found arsenic concentrations that he described in his notes as sufficient to poison dozens of people if the fabric were dissolved and the arsenic extracted. Dr. Virchow published Wilhelmine's case in the influential German medical journal Berliner Klinische Wochenschrift. He called for immediate regulation of arsenical dyes and for public education about the dangers of toxic mourning clothes. His article had some impact in German medical circles, but little effect on the fashion industry or on public behaviour. Wilhelmine survived, though with permanent kidney damage and chronic respiratory problems. She became an activist, speaking publicly about the dangers of arsenical mourning clothes and lobbying the German government for regulation. Her efforts contributed to Germany's 1895 regulations limiting arsenic in consumer goods, making Germany one of the earlier European countries to address the problem. In colonial contexts, India, Australia, South Africa, the Caribbean, British mourning customs were imposed on colonized populations, often with devastating results. Colonial subjects were expected to adopt British mourning customs when appropriate, particularly in administrative and merchant classes that dealt with British authorities. But arsenical mourning fabrics were even more dangerous in hot climates. Higher temperatures caused more rapid breakdown of arsenical dyes, increasing toxic dust production. Higher humidity increased sweat, which increased dermal absorption. Colonial women wearing Victorian mourning clothes in tropical heat were exposed to far higher arsenic levels than their British counterparts. According to research by Dr. Nupur Chaudhary at Kansas State University, British colonial records from India document numerous cases of women dying from mysterious illnesses while in mourning. These deaths were typically attributed to weakness of constitution, inability to handle the climate, or tropical diseases. But examination of the symptom descriptions and timelines suggests many were actually arsenical poisoning. The case of Kamala Mukherjee illustrates this tragically. Kamala was the widow of a Bengali merchant who worked with the British colonial administration in Calcutta in the 1880s. When her husband died, social pressure from both British and Indian communities demanded she observe proper mourning. She wore British-style arsenical mourning clothes. In Calcutta's intense heat and humidity, Kamala developed severe poisoning within 2 months. British physicians attending her attributed her illness to tropical fever and treated her with quinine, which didn't help because she didn't have malaria. She died 3 months into her mourning period. Her death was recorded as fever unspecified, but the description of her symptoms, skin lesions, hair loss, respiratory distress, kidney failure, clearly indicates arsenical poisoning. Kamala's story represents countless colonial women caught between multiple systems of social control, forced to perform grief in ways that killed them, their deaths attributed to everything except the actual cause. Toxic fashion imposed by colonial culture. Now let's examine the psychological dimensions of wearing clothes you know are poisoning you. Because by the 1870s to 1880s, the danger of arsenical mourning clothes was widely publicized. Newspapers ran articles, medical journals published warnings, yet women continued to wear poisonous mourning attire. The psychological dynamics of that choice are complex and disturbing. You are standing in a mourning warehouse in 1885. You are a new widow. You are grieving genuinely, and you are faced with a choice. The warehouse offers 2 types of mourning clothes: naturally dyed blacks that are greyish and fade quickly, and arsenical blacks that are deep and rich and fashionable and deadly. Which do you choose? The saleswoman is explaining that discerning ladies prefer the arsenical dye. It shows proper respect. It demonstrates the depth of your grief. It signals to society that you are not economizing on mourning, not cutting corners, not rushing through grief. The naturally dyed alternative, she suggests delicately, might give the impression that you are eager to get mourning over with, that perhaps you didn't truly love your husband. You know the arsenical fabric is dangerous. You've read the articles, but you also know that choosing the safer alternative will invite judgment. Your neighbours will notice. Your family will question your choice. Society will wonder about the quality of your marriage. This is psychological coercion operating through social pressure. You are being manipulated into choosing poison by a society that values appearance over survival, conformity over safety. And the truly insidious part is that you'll blame yourself for the choice, not the system that forced it. According to research by Dr. Elaine Friedgood at New York University, Victorian women's letters and diaries from this era show acute awareness of the psychological bind. Women wrote about feeling trapped between physical danger and social danger, between literal death and social death. Many expressed the feeling that social death, ostracism, scandal, being branded as an improper widow, felt worse than the abstract risk of physical death from poisoning. This is how toxic social systems work. They make the alternative to compliance seem worse than the compliance itself, even when compliance is literally lethal. Victorian women weren't stupid or ignorant. They were operating within a system that had successfully convinced them that social acceptance was worth dying for. The psychological toll of this bind was severe. Victorian medical literature documents what they called mourning melancholia, a profound depression that affected widows during their mourning period. Some of this was genuine grief, of course. but some was the psychological impact of being trapped in a poisonous system with no good options, of performing grief while your body slowly fails, of knowing you are being harmed but feeling powerless to stop it. Let me tell you about Harriet Martineau, a Victorian writer and social critic who wrote extensively about the psychological aspects of mourning. Harriet herself was never married, but she observed and analysed the mourning system with a sharp critical eye. In 1859 she published an essay titled "The Prisoner of Grief" that described mourning clothes as a cage built of fabric and social expectation, more confining than any physical prison. Harriet wrote, "A widow in deep mourning is not a free woman. She is constrained in her movements, her social interactions, her very presence in public space. The heavy crepe veil obscures her vision and marks her as a creature apart. The black dress signals her unavailability, her withdrawal from normal life. She becomes a living monument to death, expected to embody grief constantly and visibly. This performance is exhausting, even when the clothes are not literally poisonous. When they are poisonous, it becomes a slow suicide, mandated by social custom." Harriet's essay was controversial and widely criticised. She was attacked for being unwomanly, for not understanding the sacred duty of widows to honour their husbands through mourning, for encouraging improper behaviour, but her analysis was accurate. Mourning clothes were a form of social control, and the toxicity of those clothes added a physical dimension to the control. Now let's talk about the specific experience of wearing a mourning veil for hours each day, because the veil deserves its own detailed examination. The Victorian mourning veil was made from crepe, a fabric with a distinctive crimped texture created through a complex manufacturing process. To make crepe, fabric was twisted tightly while wet, then heat set to maintain the crimp. This process created a material that was stiff, heavy, and held dye differently than smooth fabrics. Crepe absorbed more dye than smooth weaves because of its increased surface area, and because deep black crepe was the most fashionable and appropriate choice for mourning veils. Manufacturers used concentrated arsenical dyes to achieve the desired colour. The result was a fabric that contained even more arsenic per square inch than regular mourning dress fabric. You are wearing this veil draped over your face and head, held in place by your widow's cap. In the first months of mourning, the veil is long enough to reach past your waist. It is thick enough that you can barely see through it. The world becomes a dark blur, shapes and shadows rather than clear images. You are literally living in darkness, symbolically appropriate, but practically dangerous. The veil creates a microenvironment around your face. Your breath warms the air trapped between the veil and your skin. This warm, moist air causes the arsenical dyes to break down more rapidly, releasing more toxic particles. You are breathing air that is saturated with arsenic dust, pulling it deep into your lungs with every breath. According to research by Dr. Philip Makowiak at the University of Maryland Medical Center, analysis of museum preserved Victorian crepe veils shows evidence of significant dye degradation, with arsenic compounds breaking down into even more volatile forms. The crepe veils that have survived are less toxic than they were when new, because the most volatile compounds have already volatilized into the air breathed by the women who wore them. The physical sensation of wearing the veil is oppressive. The crepe is scratchy against your skin, irritating even before you consider the arsenical content. It catches on your face, your neck, your shoulders. On hot days it becomes almost suffocating. You sweat under the veil, and the sweat mixes with arsenical dye, creating a toxic solution that runs down your face and neck. Your eyes are constantly irritated. The veil brushes against your eyelashes with every movement, and tiny particles of arsenical crepe get into your eyes, causing inflammation and pain. Victorian medical journals document numerous cases of morning eye, chronic eye inflammation in widows that physicians attributed to excessive weeping, but was often actually chemical irritation from arsenical veils. Let me introduce you to Dorothea Palmer, a 26-year-old widow in Liverpool, 1871. Dorothea's case was documented by her physician, Dr. Edward Whitley, who became interested in the effects of mourning veils. Specifically, Dorothea developed severe eye problems within weeks of beginning to wear her mourning veil. Her eyes became red, swollen, constantly tearing. She was sensitive to light and developed what Dr. Whitley described as pustular lesions on the eyelids. Dr. Whitley suspected the mourning veil was causing the problem and asked Dorothea to stop wearing it for 1 week as a test. She refused initially. Appearing in public without the veil would be scandalous, but eventually agreed to try wearing it only when absolutely necessary in public and removing it when at home. Her eye symptoms improved within days when she wasn't wearing the veil and worsened immediately when she put it back on. Dr. Whitley tested the veil and found high arsenic content. He published Dorothea's case as evidence that mourning veils were dangerous, even beyond their respiratory effects. But Dorothea couldn't permanently abandon her veil without social consequences. She ended up compromising wearing a thinner, naturally dyed veil when possible, and saving the heavy arsenical veil for important public appearances like church and social calls. This reduced her exposure, but didn't eliminate it. She completed her mourning period with chronic eye problems that never fully resolved. The veil also isolated you socially in ways that compounded the psychological toll of mourning. When you are veiled, people can't see your face clearly. They can't read your expressions, can't make eye contact, can't connect with you normally. Conversations become difficult. The veil muffles your voice and obscures your lips, making you harder to hear and understand. You become ghostly, less than fully present, which is symbolically appropriate for a mourning widow but psychologically devastating for a living woman. The veil transforms you from a person into a symbol, from an individual into an emblem of grief. Your identity becomes subsumed into your widowhood. According to research by sociologist Dr. Deborah Cohen at Northwestern University, Victorian women's letters describe the veil as alienating and dehumanizing. One widow wrote to her sister, "I feel I have ceased to exist as myself. I am only a mourning figure, all grief and no person. When I look in the mirror, I don't recognize the veiled creature staring back. I have become a stranger to myself." This depersonalization was part of the mourning system's purpose. Widows weren't supposed to be fully present in public life. They were supposed to be withdrawn, diminished, more absent than present. The veil enforced this physically by literally obscuring them from view. Now let's examine the economics of Victorian mourning more deeply, because understanding who profited from this system of poisoning illuminates why it persisted. Despite obvious danger, the mourning industry was huge business, generating millions of pounds annually and employing thousands of workers across manufacturing, retail, and service sectors. Start with the textile mills producing arsenical dyes and fabrics. These were major industrial operations, particularly in Britain's manufacturing centres like Manchester, Bradford, and Glasgow. According to economic historian Dr. Katrina Honeyman at the University of Leeds, British textile mills in the 1870s to 1880s produced an estimated £500,000 worth of mourning fabrics, annually equivalent to roughly £58 million, or $72 million today. The mills employed thousands of workers, mostly women and children, in conditions that were toxic, even by Victorian industrial standards. Dye workers were exposed to concentrated arsenic solutions daily, suffering severe health consequences. But the work paid slightly better than other factory work because it was recognised as dangerous, and poor families needed the money enough to risk their children's health. The arsenical dye manufacturers were another profitable sector. Companies like William Henry Perkins Dye Works produced arsenical compounds for textile use. These companies were politically connected and economically important. They lobbied aggressively against regulation, arguing that restrictions on arsenical dyes would destroy British industry and cost thousands of jobs. Retail morning warehouses like Jay's London General Morning Warehouse made enormous profits. Jay's employed over 200 staff and occupied an entire city block. They offered complete morning outfitting services. You could enter as a new widow and leave fully dressed in appropriate mourning, with everything from arsenical dress to poisonous veil to toxic jewellery, all purchased in one visit. Jay's profit margins on mourning goods were substantial because customers had no choice but to buy. Mourning wasn't optional, so demand was constant and price insensitive. Jay's could charge premium prices for arsenical dyed fabrics, marketing them as superior quality without mentioning the toxicity. According to business records preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, Jay's generated annual revenues exceeding £100,000 in the 1880s, equivalent to roughly £11.6 million or $14.4 million today. That is a multi-million-dollar business, built on selling poison to grieving women. Then there were the ancillary businesses, mourning jewellery makers, crepe manufacturers, dressmakers specialising in mourning attire, even mourning stationery suppliers. The entire ecosystem of businesses profited from death and from the social requirements around displaying grief. This economic structure created powerful opposition to reform. When activists like Lady Florence, Dixie, or physicians like Dr. Whitley called for eliminating arsenical dyes from mourning clothes, they faced coordinated resistance from an entire industry that had billions of dollars at stake in modern equivalent. Industry representatives argued that naturally dyed alternatives were inferior, that consumers preferred arsenical dyes, that regulation would destroy businesses and eliminate jobs. These arguments were effective because they appealed to economic fears and because the industry had the money to lobby politicians and fund counter-publicity. The British government was reluctant to regulate because the textile industry was economically crucial and politically influential. Victorian Britain's economy depended heavily on textile manufacturing and export. Anything that threatened the textile industry threatened British prosperity, so regulations were delayed, watered down, weakly enforced. It took decades of activism, hundreds of documented deaths, and eventually the development of acceptable synthetic alternatives before arsenical dyes were effectively banned. The ban came not because society suddenly valued women's health, but because it became economically feasible to switch to safer alternatives. Profit motives created the problem, and eventually different profit motives solved it. Now let's examine what happened during the actual moment of death for women who succumbed to arsenical poisoning from mourning clothes, because understanding the end makes the cruelty of the system more visceral. These women didn't die peacefully in their sleep. They died badly, in pain, with symptoms that terrified them and their families. Acute arsenic poisoning causes violent gastrointestinal distress, severe vomiting, bloody diarrhea, intense abdominal pain. But women dying from chronic exposure to arsenical mourning clothes usually experienced a different trajectory. Their deaths were slower, more drawn out, characterized by gradual system failure rather than acute crisis. You are 6 or 8 or 10 months into your mourning period. The arsenic has accumulated in your body to toxic levels. Your kidneys are failing, unable to filter your blood effectively. Waste products that should be excreted are building up in your bloodstream, causing uremia, urine in the blood. You feel increasingly confused, disoriented. Your thinking becomes foggy. You can't concentrate. You drift in and out of awareness. Your breathing is laboured because your lungs are scarred from months of inhaling arsenical dust. Every breath is an effort. You are constantly short of breath, even lying still. The fluid retention from kidney failure means you are developing pulmonary edema, fluid accumulating in your lungs, which makes breathing even harder. You are effectively drowning slowly from the inside. Your skin is covered in lesions that weep fluid and refuse to heal. The arsenic has destroyed your body's ability to repair tissue. You are developing bed sores because you are too weak to move much. Your hair is mostly gone. You are skeletal. wasted, a shadow of who you were. The end comes as multi-organ failure. Your kidneys shut down completely. Your liver fails. Your heart, weakened by months of poison and struggling to pump through damaged tissues, gives out. You slip into a coma from the uremia and the respiratory failure, and you die without regaining consciousness. This is what it looked like from the outside. When a Victorian widow died from her mourning clothes, the family would have seen weeks or months of decline, a gradual wasting that they attributed to grief consuming her, to her love being so strong that she couldn't survive her husband's loss. They thought her death was romantic, evidence of deep devotion. It wasn't. It was poison. After death, your body would be prepared for burial. And here is a final irony. You'd be dressed in mourning clothes for your own funeral. More black, more arsenical fabric, because even in death you had to perform grief appropriately. Your corpse would be poisoned by the same clothes that killed you. The funeral would be elaborate, expensive, another performance of grief and social status. Your family would spend money they might not have on a proper Victorian funeral with all the trappings. And everyone attending would be wearing mourning clothes, perpetuating the same toxic system that killed you. Now, let's talk about the specific experience of being a young widow with children, because the intersection of mourning requirements and motherhood created particularly cruel situations. You are a 25-year-old widow with a toddler and a nursing infant. Your husband died suddenly, leaving you with 2 young children to raise alone and very little money. You need to work to support your children, but you also need to observe proper mourning to maintain social respectability. These requirements conflict fundamentally. Mourning clothes are expensive, and you can barely afford food. Mourning clothes are impractical for the kind of work you can get: domestic service, laundry work, needlework, because they're heavy, restrictive, and delicate. But you have no choice. You somehow scrape together money for a second-hand mourning dress and veil. You wear them while trying to work, trying to care for your children, trying to survive. The arsenical fabric touches your children when you hold them, the toxic dust they breathe when they're near you. You are poisoning them while trying to care for them. And if you are nursing, you are passing arsenic through your breast milk. According to research by Dr. Brian Jackson at Dartmouth College, arsenic is readily transferred through breast milk. A nursing mother with chronic arsenic exposure will poison her infant with every feeding, though neither mother nor doctors would have recognised this in Victorian times. Infant mortality rates in Victorian England were high from many causes, but arsenical poisoning from contaminated breast milk was likely a contributor that went unrecognised. Infants who failed to thrive, who developed mysterious illnesses, who died suddenly, some percentage were probably victims of their mother's poisonous mourning clothes. Let me tell you about Rebecca Townsend, a 27-year-old widow in Birmingham, 1876. Rebecca's husband died in a workplace accident, leaving her with 3 children under age 5. She had no family support and no income except what she could earn as a laundress. She bought a cheap second-hand mourning dress and wore it while working over steaming laundry tubs in brutal heat. The combination of heat, moisture, and physical labour meant Rebecca was sweating constantly, which dramatically increased her arsenic absorption through her skin. She was also breathing hard from physical exertion, inhaling more arsenical dust from her dress. She was getting a much higher poison dose than a wealthy widow who could stay home and rest. Rebecca developed severe poisoning within 3 months. Her children, who were around her constantly, also showed symptoms: skin rashes, respiratory problems, unexplained fevers. The local physician, Dr. John Gough, documented the case in a report to the Birmingham Health Board. Dr. Gough recognised that Rebecca's mourning dress was poisoning her and her children. He tried to get her to stop wearing it, but she couldn't afford to replace it with naturally dyed alternatives, and she couldn't risk the social stigma of abandoning mourning. She was trapped by poverty and social pressure. Rebecca died 4 months into her mourning period, Her children were taken to the workhouse. The oldest, a boy of 5, died there within a year, probably from accumulated arsenic damage weakening his system. The 2 younger children survived, but with health problems that followed them into adulthood. Dr. Goff's report to the Birmingham Health Board recommended providing free non-toxic mourning clothes to poor widows, recognising that the poor were particularly vulnerable to arsenical poisoning. His recommendation was ignored as too expensive and too radical. Rebecca Townsend's story illustrates how class, gender and the mourning system intersected to create particularly deadly conditions for poor widows. They faced all the same social pressures as wealthy widows, but had fewer resources to protect themselves and more exposure due to their working conditions. Now, let's examine the resistance movements that eventually emerged against toxic mourning fashion, because change didn't happen spontaneously. It required organised activism, public education campaigns, and political pressure sustained over decades. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, was one of the first organisations to explicitly campaign against arsenical mourning clothes. The society was part of a broader dress reform movement that challenged Victorian fashion on health grounds. They argued that women's clothing should prioritise health and comfort over fashion and social convention. The society published pamphlets with titles like Mourning Without Murder and The Arsenic Widow that explained the dangers of arsenical dyes in graphic detail. They provided lists of dressmakers who used non-toxic dyes. They organised public lectures where physicians presented medical evidence of harm. According to historian Dr. Patricia Cunningham at Ohio State University, the Rational Dress Society's mourning clothes campaign was initially met with ridicule and hostility. Critics accused them of being unwomanly, of disrespecting the dead, of encouraging indecent behaviour. But the society persisted, and gradually their message gained traction. The Ladies' Sanitary Association also played a crucial role. Founded earlier in 1857 with a broader focus on women's health issues, they expanded into clothing safety in the 1860s. Their campaigns focused on educating women about toxic substances in common products, including mourning clothes. The association published household guides that included sections on identifying arsenical fabrics. They taught women to do simple chemical tests at home using materials available in any chemist shop. They provided practical alternatives, showing women that naturally dyed mourning clothes could be respectable and appropriate, even if they weren't the deepest fashionable black. Individual activists were also important. Women like Lady Florence Dixie, who publicly refused to wear arsenical mourning and faced social consequences for it, created examples that other women could follow. Their courage made it slightly easier for others to make similar choices. Male physicians who documented cases and published warnings also contributed to changing public opinion. Doctors like Orton, Whitley, Winslow, and others who took their female patients' symptoms seriously and investigated environmental causes were vital to building the evidence base that eventually forced regulatory change. The press played a role too. By the 1880s to 1890s, newspapers regularly ran stories about women poisoned by their mourning clothes. These stories, while often sensationalized, kept the issue in public consciousness and created pressure for change. Popular magazines aimed at women, like Sylvia's Home Journal and The Queen, published articles advising readers about safe mourning alternatives. These magazines had to balance their reform advocacy with not alienating advertisers who sold arsenical mourning goods, but they gradually shifted towards supporting safer options. The cumulative effect of all this activism was slow but real. Public opinion shifted. By the mid-1890s, naturally, dyed mourning clothes were becoming more socially acceptable. The deepest arsenical blacks were going out of fashion, replaced by slightly lighter but safer blacks that didn't carry the same poison load. Technology helped too. The development of synthetic dyes in the 1880s to 1890s provided alternatives to arsenical compounds. Aniline dyes derived from coal tar could produce deep blacks without arsenic. They had their own problems. Some were carcinogenic, but they weren't acutely toxic the way arsenical dyes were. Manufacturers switched to synthetic dyes not primarily for safety reasons, but because they were cheaper and easier to produce in bulk. But the result was the same. Arsenical mourning clothes gradually disappeared from the market because they were no longer economically optimal. The regulatory end came with Britain's 1903 Factory and Workshop Act, which limited arsenic content in consumer goods. Similar regulations followed in other European countries and the United States over the following decade. By 1910, arsenical mourning clothes had mostly vanished from Western fashion, but let's not forget the cost of that delay. From the 1860s, when the danger was first widely documented, to the 1910s, when arsenical mourning clothes finally disappeared. 50 years passed. 50 years of women being poisoned, of children being orphaned, of families being destroyed. How many women died in those 50 years because economic interests and social conservatism delayed necessary change? Dr. Alison Matthews David estimates conservatively that tens of thousands of British women alone suffered significant health consequences from arsenical mourning clothes during the Victorian era, and thousands likely died globally, accounting for Europe, the Americas, and colonial contexts. The death toll was probably far higher. These women are mostly forgotten, their deaths attributed to other causes, their suffering dismissed as the natural toll of grief, but they deserve to be remembered. Each one was a person with hopes, fears, dreams, relationships. Each one died unnecessarily from a preventable poisoning that society allowed to continue, because changing would have been inconvenient, economically costly, socially disruptive. Now let's examine some of the most heartbreaking specific details of how arsenical mourning affected individual women's lives beyond just their physical poisoning. Because the toxicity wasn't just medical, it was social, psychological, economic, existential. Think about the widow who realized her mourning clothes were poisoning her, but couldn't stop wearing them because she had marriageable daughters whose reputations would be destroyed if their mother was seen as an improper widow. She chose to continue poisoning herself to protect her daughters' marriage prospects. She died to preserve their social futures. Think about the widow who was an artist or musician and found that the arsenic poisoning damaged her hands, causing tremors and loss of fine motor control that destroyed her ability to practice her art. She lost not just her health, but her identity, her purpose, her creative outlet, all because social custom demanded she dress her grief in poison. Think about the widow who was a teacher or governess and found that arsenic-induced cognitive problems made it impossible to continue her work. She lost her livelihood, her independence, her ability to support herself. She ended up dependent on family charity or in a workhouse, impoverished by mourning. Think about the widow who nursed her poisoned infant and watched the baby waste away, developing the same skin lesions and respiratory problems she herself had. She realized she was poisoning her child, but didn't understand how until it was too late. The guilt of that would have been unbearable. These aren't hypothetical scenarios, they're drawn from actual documented cases in Victorian medical journals and women's personal papers. The emotional and psychological toll of arsenical mourning went far beyond the physical symptoms. Let's examine one more detailed case because individual stories make the horror more real than statistics ever can. Her name was Margaret Price, and she was a 30-year-old widow in Cardiff, Wales, 1889. Margaret's case is particularly well documented because she kept a detailed journal that survived and was eventually donated to the National Library of Wales. Margaret was educated, articulate, and aware of the dangers of arsenical mourning clothes. She'd read the articles, seen the medical warnings. When her husband died in a mining accident, she deliberately sought out a dressmaker who used naturally dyed fabrics. She commissioned mourning clothes that were safer, even though they were slightly more expensive and not quite as fashionably black. Margaret thought she'd made the right choice, that she'd protected herself. But what she didn't know was that the dressmaker, trying to satisfy Margaret's desire for deep black while keeping costs down, had supplemented the natural dyes with small amounts of arsenical dye to achieve a richer colour. The dressmaker didn't mention this because she assumed Margaret wouldn't notice and wouldn't mind. Margaret began experiencing arsenical poisoning symptoms about 4 months into her mourning period. She was confused because she thought her mourning clothes were safe. She consulted her physician, Dr. David Williams, who suspected the clothes immediately and had them tested. The discovery that they contained arsenic, despite Margaret's careful attempts to avoid it, devastated her. Margaret's journal entry from the day she learned the test results is heartbreaking. "I tried so hard to do this safely. I read everything I could find about the dangers. I spent extra money I could ill afford to ensure my mourning clothes would not harm me, and still I have been poisoned." The dressmaker admits she added arsenical dye without telling me because she wanted the black to be proper. She prioritized appearance over my health without my knowledge or consent. I am furious and heartbroken and terrified. What else have I been lied to about? How can I trust anything when even my deliberate efforts to protect myself are undermined? Margaret survived, but the betrayal affected her profoundly. She became an activist, speaking publicly about her experience and warning other women not to trust assurances about non-toxic mourning clothes without independent verification. She lobbied Welsh authorities for better regulation of the textile trade and for requirements that dyers disclose all chemicals used. Margaret's activism contributed to Wales adopting some of the earliest UK regulations on arsenical dyes, even before the 1903 National Act. Her case illustrates that even informed, educated, cautious women were at risk because the entire system was contaminated with dishonesty and profit motives that prioritized profit over safety. Now let's talk about what modern toxicology and forensic analysis has revealed about Victorian arsenical poisoning through examination of preserved remains and artifacts. Because science has given us tools to see this historical horror more clearly than Victorian people themselves could. Dr. Andrew Mehag and his team at Queen's University Belfast have analysed Victorian hair samples from museum collections and from exhumed remains. Hair analysis is particularly useful for detecting chronic arsenic exposure because arsenic accumulates in hair as it grows, creating a timeline of exposure. By analysing different segments of a hair shaft, you can track when exposure began, how intense it was, and how long it continued. Mehag's research found elevated arsenic levels in hair samples from known Victorian widows that were hundreds of times higher than baseline. Some samples showed arsenic concentrations comparable to what you'd see in acute poisoning cases, except spread out over months rather than hours. The hair literally recorded the slow poisoning in its structure. Analysis of Victorian mourning clothes in museum collections has revealed arsenic levels that shock modern toxicologists. Dr. Alison Matthews-David's analysis of dresses at the Royal Ontario Museum found some pieces with arsenic concentrations so high that the dresses themselves are considered hazardous materials requiring special handling and storage. Museum conservators working with Victorian mourning clothes have to wear protective equipment, gloves, masks, sometimes full protective suits, to handle items that Victorian women wore directly against their skin for hours daily. The disconnect between how we treat these objects now versus how they were worn then illustrates how dangerous they truly were. Some museums have had to remove Victorian mourning clothes from display entirely because they're too toxic to safely exhibit. The Kyoto Costume Institute in Japan removed several Victorian mourning dresses from their collection in the 2000s, when analysis showed arsenic levels that posed risks to museum staff and visitors even through display cases. Examination of Victorian cemetery remains has also revealed the scope of arsenical poisoning. When remains are exhumed for legitimate research or burial purposes, toxicological analysis sometimes shows massive arsenic accumulation in bones and teeth. Arsenic binds to bone tissue and can persist for centuries after death, creating a permanent record of exposure. Dr. Philippe Charlier, a forensic pathologist in France who specializes in analyzing historical remains, has examined several Victorian women buried in mourning clothes. The arsenic levels in their bones and in the fabric they were buried in creates, in his words, a tomb within a tomb. They're encased in poison, even in death. One particularly striking case involved the 2012 exhumation of a Victorian family plot in London. 3 women buried in the 1870s to 1880s all showed severe arsenical poisoning from analysis of their remains. They were buried in their mourning clothes, which had partially preserved due to the arsenic's antimicrobial properties. The fabric, even after 130 plus years, still contained detectable arsenic. These women were literally too toxic to safely handle without modern protective equipment. The forensic evidence is unambiguous. Victorian arsenical mourning was mass poisoning on a scale we're only now fully comprehending. Modern toxicology gives us tools to see what Victorian medicine couldn't or wouldn't see. But thousands of women were systematically poisoned by fashion. Let's examine the parallels between Victorian arsenical mourning and modern consumer product safety issues, because the dynamics haven't disappeared, even if the specific products have changed. Today we have different toxins and different products, but the underlying patterns, corporate profit prioritized over consumer safety, regulatory delays, vulnerable populations bearing the brunt of harm, remain depressingly familiar. Think about modern fast fashion and the chemical treatments used on cheap clothing. Formaldehyde resins to prevent wrinkling, azo dyes that can break down into carcinogenic compounds, heavy metals in pigments, and finishes. These chemicals aren't as immediately toxic as Victorian arsenic, but they're present in clothes millions of people wear daily, and we don't fully understand their long-term health effects. Just like Victorian women were told arsenical mourning clothes were perfectly safe, modern consumers are told that chemical levels in fast fashion are below regulatory limits and pose no risk. But regulatory limits are often based on industry-funded research and assume single exposures rather than cumulative effects from wearing chemically treated clothes daily for years. Think about cosmetics and personal care products. The average woman uses 12 personal care products daily containing 168 different chemicals, many untested for long-term safety. Some of these chemicals are endocrine disruptors, potential carcinogens, neurotoxins. We're exposing ourselves to chemical cocktails that interact in ways we don't understand. Victorian women put arsenic on their skin through their clothes. Modern women put parabens, phthalates, synthetic fragrances, and dozens of other chemicals on their skin through cosmetics. The specific chemicals differ, but the dynamic of prioritizing beauty standards over health concerns remains. Think about occupational exposures in beauty industries. Nail salon workers are exposed to volatile organic compounds daily, developing respiratory problems, neurological issues, reproductive problems. Hair stylists are exposed to chemical dyes and treatments, suffering elevated rates of certain cancers. Just like Victorian dye workers were poisoned making arsenical fabrics, modern beauty workers are poisoned providing beauty services. And just like Victorian society was slow to regulate arsenical dyes because of economic interests, modern society is slow to regulate beauty industry chemicals because the industry is powerful, politically connected, and economically important. The pattern repeats. Let's talk about what the Victorian arsenical mourning experience teaches us about gendered vulnerability to environmental toxins, because it is not coincidental that this poisoning primarily affected women. The fashion system that mandated arsenical mourning was gendered, and that gendering created differential vulnerability. Victorian men had mourning requirements too, but they were less stringent, less toxic, shorter in duration. Men wore black suits with mourning bands, but their blacks didn't have to be as deep. Their fabrics were less heavily dyed, their exposure was lower, and men's mourning periods ended faster, 6 months to a year versus 2.5 years or more for women. This created a situation where women bore the vast majority of poisoning risk from mourning customs. Women's bodies were treated as more disposable, more subject to social control, less worthy of protection. The same gender dynamics appear in modern contexts. Women bear more of the burden of modern beauty standards, and therefore more exposure to cosmetic chemicals. Women are more likely to work in beauty service industries, and therefore face more occupational chemical exposures. Women's health concerns are more likely to be dismissed as hysteria or emotional rather than being taken seriously, exactly like Victorian women's arsenical poisoning symptoms were dismissed as grief. The environmental health movement has documented that many modern environmental toxins affect women differently than men because of hormonal differences, body composition differences, and differences in exposure patterns. Endocrine disruptors, for example, can affect women's reproductive health at far lower doses than they affect men, but research on these gendered health effects is often underfunded because women's health is systematically undervalued in medical research. Just like Victorian medicine didn't seriously investigate arsenical mourning until the evidence became overwhelming, modern medicine is slow to investigate gendered environmental health effects. Understanding the Victorian arsenical mourning tragedy helps us recognize these ongoing patterns. Women's vulnerability to environmental toxins isn't natural or inevitable. It is created by social systems that value appearance over health, profit over safety, and men's well-being over women's. Now let's examine the specific experiences of Victorian women who resisted the mourning system and what happened to them. Because resistance was possible even if it was dangerous. These women's stories show both the possibility of resistance and the costs of defying social norms. We've already discussed Lady Florence Dixie, who had the protection of wealth and title. But what about women without those privileges who still resisted? Their stories are harder to find because they weren't well documented, but fragments appear in court records, poor law records, and asylum records. There are records of women who refused to wear mourning at all being brought before magistrates on various pretexts. Disturbing the peace, suspicious behaviour, moral offences. The real issue was their failure to observe proper mourning. But that wasn't technically a legal offence, so other charges were manufactured. There are records of women committed to asylums by their families for improper behaviour that included refusing to wear mourning clothes. The logic was that refusing mourning demonstrated mental illness. No sane woman would fail to properly mourn her husband. The fact that the woman might have been trying to protect her health was irrelevant. One documented case involves a woman named Sarah Lewis, committed to the Bristol Lunatic Asylum in 1877 by her late husband's family. Sarah's insanity consisted primarily of refusing to wear the arsenical mourning clothes they'd purchased for her, and insisting on wearing naturally dyed alternatives she'd made herself. Her refusal was taken as evidence that she was glad her husband was dead, which meant she must be insane because what woman wouldn't mourn her husband? Sarah was held in the asylum for 18 months before being released, her health destroyed not by poison but by the asylum's treatments, which included forcible feeding, cold water immersions, and solitary confinement. Her resistance to toxic mourning led to a different kind of systematic harm. These stories show that the mourning system enforced compliance through multiple mechanisms. If you wore arsenical mourning clothes, you were poisoned. If you refused to wear them, you faced social ostracism, potential legal consequences, even forcible commitment. The system was designed to allow no escape, but some women did escape through death itself. There are accounts of widows who, learning their mourning clothes were poisoning them, chose to stop wearing them, even knowing they'd face social consequences. They prioritized survival over social acceptance, and they lived to face the judgment. One such woman was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first female physician. When Elizabeth's husband died in 1907, she mourned privately, but refused to observe the full traditional mourning requirements. She wore simple black for a few months, then returned to her regular clothing and her medical practice. Elizabeth faced significant criticism from conservative quarters. She was accused of being unfeminine, of not properly loving her husband, of setting a bad example for other women, but she had the protection of her professional status, her established reputation, and the historical moment. By 1907, rigid mourning requirements were weakening. Elizabeth wrote in a private letter, "I observed James's memory by continuing the work we both believed in, not by wrapping myself in poison and withdrawing from life. I chose to honour him through living fully rather than through dying slowly. If that makes me improper, so be it." Elizabeth's choice was possible for her because of timing, social position, and personal conviction. Most Victorian women didn't have those advantages, but her example shows that resistance was possible and that some women did choose differently. Now let's talk about the environmental legacy of Victorian arsenical dye production, because the poisoning didn't end when people stopped wearing the clothes. The environmental contamination from 19th century dye works persists in some locations to this day. Victorian dye factories were monumentally polluting. The arsenical compounds used in dye production were dumped into rivers, released into air, buried in soil. Areas around major dye works became toxic wastelands, where nothing would grow and where workers lived among poison. According to research by environmental historian Dr. Peter Thorsheim at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, analysis of soil and sediment near former Victorian dye works shows arsenic contamination that persists 150 plus years later. Some former industrial sites have arsenic levels so high that they're classified as hazardous waste sites, requiring environmental remediation. The River Irwell in Manchester, which ran through the heart of Britain's textile industry, was so polluted with arsenical dyes and other chemicals that it was essentially dead. No fish, no plants, just toxic water. Modern environmental testing of sediment cores from the Irwell shows layers of arsenic corresponding to peak dye production periods. In the late 1800s, communities near dye works suffered elevated disease rates, cancer rates, developmental disabilities, neurological problems. All were higher in populations living near Victorian dye factories. This environmental justice issue affected the poorest populations who had no choice but to live in the cheapest housing near industrial pollution. The workers, primarily women and children, had no protection from the arsenical dye solutions they worked with daily. They wore no gloves, no masks, no protective clothing. They breathed arsenical vapors, absorbed arsenic through their skin, carried arsenic contaminated clothing home, where it exposed their families. One particularly tragic documented case involves the children who lived near the Bradford dye works in the 1870s. A local physician, Dr. Thomas Clifford Albert, documented that children in these areas showed signs of chronic arsenic poisoning at rates far exceeding the general population. The children had skin lesions, developmental delays, and elevated mortality rates. Dr. Albert traced the poisoning to multiple sources: contaminated water from the river where dye waste was dumped, arsenical dust that settled on streets and homes, contaminated soil where children played. These children were poisoned by the industrial infrastructure that produced fashionable mourning clothes for wealthy widows. The environmental injustice was stark and undeniable. Modern environmental cleanup of former Victorian dye works sites reveals the massive scale of contamination. When developers try to redevelop these historical industrial sites, they often discover arsenic levels that make the land unusable without extensive and expensive remediation. The cost of Victorian fashion is still being paid by modern communities. Let's examine the psychological profile of Victorian society that allowed this mass poisoning to continue for decades, despite clear evidence of harm. What does it tell us about collective human psychology that a society could know it was poisoning its widows and continue doing it anyway? Part of the answer is cognitive dissonance. Individual members of Victorian society might have felt uneasy about arsenical morning, but confronting that unease would require changing behavior in ways that were socially costly. So instead, people engaged in elaborate rationalizations. The arsenic levels aren't really that dangerous. They were. Only poor quality fabrics are toxic, not the expensive ones. All arsenical-dyed fabrics were toxic regardless of quality. If you are careful and don't wear the clothes all the time, you'll be fine. Chronic low-level exposure was still poisonous. The women dying must have had weak constitutions or pre-existing conditions. No, they were being poisoned. These rationalizations allowed people to continue participating in the system, while avoiding the guilt and cognitive dissonance of acknowledging harm. It is the same psychological mechanism that allows modern people to participate in systems we know are harmful. We rationalize, minimize, deflect responsibility. There was also a strong element of just world fallacy, the belief that bad things happen to people who deserve them. If women were dying from mourning clothes, some psychological defense mechanism suggested they must have done something wrong. Maybe they were wearing cheap clothes, or wearing them improperly, or already unhealthy. It was psychologically easier to blame the victims than to acknowledge that the system itself was broken. Authority figures reinforced these rationalizations. Textile industry representatives assured the public that their products were safe. Some physicians dismissed concerns about arsenical clothing. Fashion authorities insisted that proper mourning required arsenical blacks. These authorities gave people permission to ignore their own unease and continue participating in the poisoning system. There was also diffusion of responsibility. No single person was responsible for the entire system, so no single person felt responsible for fixing it. The dye manufacturers said they were just meeting market demand. The dressmakers said they were just following fashion. The customers said they were just following social requirements. Everyone passed responsibility to someone else. And meanwhile, women kept dying. This is how mass harms persist, through a combination of cognitive dissonance, rationalization, victim blaming, authority endorsement, and diffusion of responsibility. Understanding these psychological mechanisms helps us recognize when we're participating in similar dynamics today. Now let's talk about what a typical day looked like for a Victorian widow in arsenical mourning clothes, walking through the experience hour by hour to make the horror more visceral and immediate. You are 6 months into mourning. Here is your day. You wake at dawn. The first thing you are aware of is the persistent cough. You've been coughing for weeks, bringing up dark sputum that stains your handkerchiefs. You tell yourself it is just a cold that won't quite go away. It is not. It is your lungs, damaged from months of inhaling arsenical dust, trying to clear themselves. You dress in your mourning clothes with your maid's help. The dress is heavy, at least 10 pounds of fabric, all of it saturated with arsenical dye. Your maid helps you into the layers, chemise, corset, petticoats, the dress itself. The fabric rubs against skin that is already irritated, covered in small lesions that itch and burn. You wince but say nothing. Complaining about discomfort seems weak. The maid arranges your veil, pinning it to your widow's cap. The crepe falls across your face like a dark curtain, limiting your vision. The world becomes dim and blurred. This is your prison for the day, this arsenical cage you cannot escape. Breakfast is difficult. You are nauseous most mornings now, though you tell yourself it is grief suppressing your appetite. You manage some tea and toast. As you eat, your hands tremble slightly, making it hard to hold the cup steady. The tremors have been getting worse. You assume it is nerves. It is actually peripheral neuropathy from arsenic damaging your nervous system. After breakfast, you sit in the morning room and try to do needlework. This used to soothe you, but now your hands shake too much for fine work. Your eyes hurt, the constant irritation from the veil, the inflammation from arsenical particles getting into your eyes. Everything hurts. Actually, your joints ache. Your head throbs. You feel constantly unwell. A visitor calls to pay respects. You receive her in your mourning clothes, veiled, hardly able to see her face clearly through the crepe. She expresses sympathy and comments on how appropriate your mourning is, how deep your blacks, how proper your dress. You thank her, not mentioning that your proper dress is killing you. Lunch is barely touched. Your appetite has disappeared. You are losing weight rapidly, becoming skeletal. Everyone says it is grief wasting you away, proof of how deeply you loved your husband. You are too tired to correct them, and besides, what would you say? That you are wasting away from poison, not grief. The afternoon is spent resting because you are exhausted constantly. But rest doesn't help because the poisoning continues even when you are lying still. The arsenical dress presses against your skin, leaching toxins into your body. The air you breathe is contaminated with arsenical dust from the fabric that surrounds you. There is no escape. Evening brings dinner which you pick at without enthusiasm. Then perhaps some reading, though the veil makes it difficult to see the pages clearly and your concentration wavers. Your mind feels foggy, thoughts slippery and hard to hold. This too is arsenic, affecting your brain function, but you don't know that. At bedtime you finally remove the mourning clothes. The relief is immediate and profound. Your skin can breathe. You can see clearly for a few hours until you dress again tomorrow. You are free from the poison, but the damage continues because arsenic is in your tissues now, in your blood and bones and organs, destroying you from within, even when you are not actively exposed. You lie in bed, coughing, aching, exhausted, but unable to sleep well. You pray for strength to endure the remaining months of mourning. You don't pray for the mourning to end because that would be improper, suggesting you are eager to move on, that you didn't love your husband enough. You've internalized the system so thoroughly that you police your own thoughts. This is one day. You have hundreds more ahead of you. Each day the arsenic accumulates a little more. Each day you get a little sicker. Each day closer to the end of mourning, but also closer to the end of your life. This was the reality for thousands of Victorian widows. Day after day of slow poisoning, of discomfort and illness rationalized as grief, of suffering praised as devotion. This was the deadly fashion of grief. Before we close tonight's journey, I want you to think about one final thing. The Victorian widows who are completely forgotten, whose names we'll never know, whose suffering left no documentary trace. The poorest widows, the ones who couldn't afford doctors so their poisoning was never diagnosed. The ones who died in workhouses or slums and were buried in unmarked graves. The ones whose families couldn't read or write so left no letters, no diaries, no records. For every Isabella Banks or Eleanor Hartley whose cases were documented, there were dozens or hundreds whose weren't. For every widow whose name appears in a medical journal or a parish register, there are countless others who died anonymously, their poisoning unrecognized, their stories untold. These anonymous dead deserve to be remembered too. They were real people who suffered real pain, who made impossible choices in an impossible system, who died because their society valued fashion over their lives. They matter. Their deaths matter. Their suffering matters. When you think about Victorian arsenical mourning, don't just think about the documented cases and the named victims. Think about the vast invisible majority whose stories are lost, but whose lives and deaths were just as real, just as tragic, just as preventable. And remember that this pattern continues today with different victims and different poisons. Every time someone dies from a preventable environmental exposure, someone profits. Every time health concerns are dismissed for economic reasons, someone suffers. Every time regulation is delayed, despite clear evidence of harm, someone pays the price. The Victorian widows can't speak for themselves anymore, but we can speak for them by recognizing the patterns they died in and refusing to repeat them. We can honor their memory by building systems that value human life over profit, health over appearance, safety over convenience. We can learn from their tragedy and do better. As you drift off to sleep tonight, hold in your mind the image of the Victorian widow in her poisonous blacks, her veiled face, her slow decline, Feel compassion for her impossible situation. Feel anger at the system that trapped her. Feel gratitude that you live in a time when such overt poisoning is no longer socially mandated. And feel responsibility to ensure that different forms of systematic harm don't continue unchallenged in our own time. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through fashion, poison, and the deadly performance of grief. Thank you for bearing witness to women whose suffering was dismissed, whose deaths were romanticized, whose reality was far darker than the elegant image of Victorian mourning we often see in museums and films. By understanding their truth, we honor them and we equip ourselves to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own lives. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed awareness of what you wear and why, with the courage to question social demands that harm you, with compassion for all the women throughout history who've been caught between social acceptance and personal survival. May you choose yourself, always, even when the world tells you that is selfish or improper or unfeminine. The Victorian widows couldn't make that choice. You can sleep well and remember that your life is worth more than any dress, any fashion, any performance of grief or beauty or proper femininity. Good night.